Welcome to the Gateway Radio Program, a weekly radio series discussing the issues of human potential and technologies. The Gateway Radio Program is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a research and educational organization dedicated to the exploration of conscious awareness. Here now is your host of the Gateway Radio Program, Mark Serta.
Welcome to another edition of the Gateway Radio Program. I'm Mark Serta. I'd like to begin this program by asking you, the listener, to participate in a little exercise. It's a short one, and it's a very revealing exercise. I'd like you all to personally affirm for yourself and believe that everything I'm about to read to you is absolute truth. As I do this, I'm going to read an abridged version of this because of time considerations. It's something called the Western Creed, and as you hear these words, I invite you to observe any emotional response that you may have to them. It reads like this. I believe in the material universe as the only and ultimate reality, a universe controlled by fixed laws and blind chance. I affirm that the universe has no creator, no objective purpose, and no objective meaning or destiny. I maintain that the ideas about God or gods, enlightened beings, prophets and saviors, and other non-physical beings or forces are superstitious and delusional. Life and consciousness are totally identical to physical process and arose from physical interactions of blind physical forces. Like the rest of life and my consciousness have no objective purpose, meaning, or destiny. I believe that all judgments, values, and moralities, whether my own or others, are subjective, arising solely from biological determinants, personal history, and chance. I affirm that churches have no real use other than social support, that there are no objective sins to commit or to be forgiven for, that there is no retribution for sin or reward for virtue other than that which I can arrange, directly or through others. Virtue for me is getting what I want without being caught and punished by others. I maintain that the death of the body is the death of the mind. There is no afterlife, and all hopes of such is nonsense. Now, some of you may have found comfort in these words, and that's okay. Others, like me, had a problem with a bit of it. I'd like for you all to ask yourself what parts of this statement seem like they're obviously true descriptions of reality, and if they feel true, how do you personally know that they are true? I mean, have you tested them for yourself? And also, an even deeper question, do you have any fears of looking into some of these ideas a little too deeply? If so, why? I found that this was a very powerful exercise for me, and with me today is the man who wrote this Western Creed, not necessarily because he believes these words, but because they illustrate the degree to which a distorted form of science, or what we might call scientism, has helped shape our Western beliefs and values. With me today is Charles T. Tart. He's a distinguished visiting professor at the University of Nevada, sitting on, what was that chair again, Charlie?
The Bigelow Chair of Consciousness Studies.
And he's also an author of numerous books, which I highly recommend, and for some over 30 years now, he's been a leading parapsychological researcher and scientist. Charlie, it's really good to have you on this program. Thanks for visiting us.
It's a pleasure to be here, Mark.
You've written some very powerful books on the topics of spirituality and science, most recent of which is a book entitled Body, Mind, and Spirit. It's a compendium of writings from several other researchers in the same field, including yourself. In Chapter 1 in your latest book, you described an adventure that you personally had addressing many representatives of various religions at the 1993 Second World Parliament of Religions. Why did they ask you, a scientist, to address them?
I wondered about that. I mean, this was a worldwide gathering from representatives of the major religions all over the planet. Mm-hmm. But I guess they realized that science and religion have quite a long history of conflict with each other.
Yeah.
And that it's not healthy to have this conflict, especially since the real conflicts between scientism, which is a kind of fundamentalist religion in itself,
yes,
and poor spirituality. Mm-hmm. So I was asked to talk on the relationship between science and religion, and I found it a very interesting opportunity to do so.
Mm-hmm. Well, we as a species, as you pointed out, have dealt with this dichotomy of science sort of canceling out spirituality. And you actually bring it up as a point in your latest book that we have this dichotomy of either being biochemical accidents or conversely spiritual beings of incredible potential, as you put it. And
or
of course,
maybe something else.
Yeah, true. But the ancient scriptures would certainly support that, and current philosophy also suggests that. But let's assume for a second that the former is absolute truth, that we are just accidents of nature, as the Western creed suggests. Why would we need to attach a myth to ourselves as having a higher meaning or to our existence?
Well, speaking as a psychologist, which is my training, it's clear to me that people need meaning in order to be healthy. If you don't think your life makes sense in terms of some larger sphere of meaning than just filling your daily needs and surviving, you don't flourish. In fact, you sicken. It's sort of like a vitamin deficiency. If you don't get enough of certain vitamins, all sorts of deficiency diseases result. If you don't have a solid sense of meaning in your universe, you start to sicken also. And you get the kind of world we live in nowadays, which is so materialistic, where greed's the dominant force and whatnot. That's what I was trying to illustrate with that Western Creed exercise, which I use in my workshops, usually attended by people who think they're very spiritually oriented people. But I think it's important psychologically to realize that simply because we're citizens of the modern world, we've had this scientism, this total materialism indoctrinated so thoroughly into us that it has major effects on our life. Yes. So people do that creed, and almost nobody likes it. I call it my sadder but wiser exercise. But they realize that part of the reasons they're having difficulty in life, in spite of a spiritual orientation, is the kind of stuttering and conflict caused, because so much of them believes that things are nothing but a material accident with no real meaning.
Right. Well, let's pretend for a moment that that is absolutely the truth, that we are biochemical accidents. I mean, are we being delusional?
That's what scientism thinks about people with any kind of psychic or spiritual inclinations, that they are indeed being delusional, that they don't have the courage to face up to the harsh truth that there is no inherent meaning in life. Now, if I really believe that creed, I would reorder my life to get as much sex and power and physical pleasure as possible, and forget all this other stuff. And when I didn't feel good about that, I'm sure I could go to a doctor and get some drug that would make me stop having any deep worries.
Right.
That's one of the sad parts of modern life. We have a lot of ways of avoiding really facing the question of what's the meaning in my life.
Well, I'd like to go back to a statement that you made about why they asked you to speak at this World Parliament of Religions. Do you ever see a possibility of science and religion actually merging to come across with answers to the big questions that we all have? Why are we here? That sort of thing?
Merging might be a little bit too big a word to use in this context, but I think there are possibilities of genuine science and genuine spirituality enriching each other. Okay? Now, when I went, one of the reasons I accepted the invitation to this conference was that it was the 100-year anniversary of the previous one, which was the first time a lot of Eastern ideas got expressed in the West. And that was also when Swami Vivekananda came to the West, and Swami Vivekananda's books on yoga and how there was a science of yoga actually had a great influence on me when I was a young man. He took the attitude, which I think is essentially a scientific one, that you don't have to believe that yoga is true, or any system of spirituality is true, but rather here are directions for things to do, experiments you can carry out, as it were, and you can see for yourself whether it works or not, whether it makes sense or not.
Right.
And to me, that's the essence of the genuine scientific attitude, to always be open-minded, to look at what actually happened, test out what you think about it, and see what actually happened. Scientism, on the other hand, is a psychological change that happens when people get so confident in the particular popular scientific theories of the time that they forget that those are just the best attempts we can do at the time for explaining things, and start thinking of them as the absolute truth. And then the mind hardens and people get doctrinaire and refuse to look at facts and so forth. And that's where our conflicts come today. Scientism is very dominant, and it dismisses spirituality. But even while there's some nonsense mixed under the idea of spirituality, there's some vital truths in there. If you deny that, you injure people.
And all of your research in parapsychology has yielded quite a bit of proof that psi functioning exists. And these folks have a problem with it, is what you're saying to me.
Yes. Now, that's really the whole point of this Body, Mind, Spirit book, which is my latest book, to say, look, using really high-quality scientific methods in the field of parapsychology, we can show that the human mind can do things like occasional telepathy or clairvoyance or something like that that make no sense in a purely materialistic view.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can be a good scientist. You don't have to say, I don't like what the Western creed teaches, so I'm just going to believe something that makes me feel good. That's not a very sophisticated position.
Not at all.
But here, you can draw on the findings of parapsychology, as I and my colleagues did in the Body, Mind, Spirit book, and say, no, we have excellent scientific evidence that the mind can do these things, and that establishes a general groundwork for the fact that the spiritual may be real in important ways.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can get on with looking into the spiritual and trying to live our lives that way and understand it without having to feel like we're being unscientific, We are a scientific culture. That's an important part of our heritage. We can't turn our backs on it.
Yeah, it's taken us quite far.
Yeah, but we really have to distinguish between genuine science and scientism. The latter is really a depressing dogmatic religion. Okay, that Western creed exercise is, in a sense, the creed of scientism.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not good science. It's
right.
not essential science.
And it leaves us feeling void of any spiritual nurturing.
Exactly.
And sense of purpose, of course.
That makes a few people feel good, incidentally, because one of the sad things is that a lot of people have been raised in sort of fundamentalist Christian orientations that make them feel so bad about themselves.
Right.
They're born in sin. They're not going to make it. They're going to blow it no matter what and probably go to hell.
Right.
A Western creed thing for a person like that is a great relief. There is no heaven and hell. I don't have standards to live up to. It's actually therapeutic in that sense.
Right.
But since it's only part of the story, it only takes people so far.
Mm-hmm. Well, having been a parapsychologist for much of your life now, for those who don't really understand that branch of science, what exactly is parapsychology?
Parapsychology literally means beside psychology. It was a coined term by J.B. Rhine to replace the older term of psychic research.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really the scientific and scholarly study of phenomena that don't make sense in materialistic terms. So if you do a telepathy experiment, for instance, you basically say, let's assume our understanding of the physical world is complete. We know everything that's basically important to know.
Right.
Given that, I can set up an impossible situation. I can put people in rooms 100 miles apart, for instance, with no telephone or radio, and they can't communicate with each other.
Mm-hmm.
But suppose I set up an experiment to see if sometimes some bit of communication gets through. If it can, and that's a parapsychological experiment, it shows there is a reality to something like telepathy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that shows our physical understanding of the world isn't wrong, but what's wrong is to think that we completely understand the world and then to blindly use it to just rule out things without looking at them.
Right.
If someone is religious and prays, for instance, the scientific point of view, notice I'm not saying scientific, but the scientific point of view, is that they're deluded, of course. I mean, if they're talking to themselves in their own head, all they're doing is kind of rearranging some electricity and chemicals in their own head, and it means nothing except maybe it's therapeutic for a person. Maybe they comfort themselves with this illusion. But wait a minute, we have evidence that sometimes human beings use telepathy. We know there is a mechanism. We don't understand it, but there's some kind of mechanism or process to get information out of your head in a totally unknown way. Well, now the idea that there's something or someone to pray to is not quite so outlandish as it was a moment ago.
Right. Well, it's quite amazing to me how science and spirituality have not been able to reconcile their differences. But it seems to me that science has a real, no aversion whatsoever to accepting some of the natural mysteries in the physical world, in physical science. They may not be able to explain them, but they're okay with them. It seems that they're having a hard time with concepts like metaphysics and parapsychology. I'm speaking of the other disciplines, of course. How do you deal with that?
Well, first off, you have to recognize there's a reality factor here.
Mm-hmm.
If you just look at what is said, written, and done under concepts like parapsychology and metaphysics, you're going to find an awful lot of nonsense and superstition.
Yes.
And that gives the whole area a bad flavor in terms of scientists who want to look at it. Okay, that's why this Body, Mind, Spirit book, for instance, it's not a popular, new age, you are wonderful kind of book,
right?
Where anything labeled psychic is accepted as true. People have delusions about this area. Rather, it's information from real scientific experts in this field about what information you can count on as being true about the paranormal, and the implications of that for our spirituality. This discrimination is really important. People have to learn to discriminate.
I want to talk about some of those implications when we come back from these messages. With me today is Charles Tart, author of many books, the most recent of which is Body, Mind, Spirit. It's a book I highly recommend for those of you with open and discriminating minds. The Gateway Radio program will return in just a moment.
The science of the mind, consciousness. Throughout human history, mankind has asked the basic questions of our existence. Who are we and where are we going? The Monroe Institute offers a unique series of programs designed to help you explore your fullest potentials and unlock the secrets of conscious awareness. Utilizing its patented Hemi-Sync technology, these week-long programs present you the opportunity to explore your own inner world and beyond. For information on the Monroe Institute, its products and services, access our website, monroeinstitute.org, or call 1-800-541-2488.
Hi, this is Frank DeMarco, Chairman of Hampton Roads Publishing Company. Since 1989, Hampton Roads has been publishing titles on a variety of cutting-edge topics. Visionary fiction uplifts the spirit and promotes metaphysical understanding. Alternative medicine promotes gentler, more effective tools for wellness. And metaphysics gives insights into out-of-body experiences, past lives, prophecy, and Toltec shamanism. Hampton Roads gives you the books that you really want but won't find anywhere else. Visit our website, www.hrpub.com. That's www.hrpub.com. Or call 1-800-766-8009 for a free catalog. 1-800-766-8009. Hampton Roads Publishing Company. Books for the evolving human spirit.
And we're back with Dr. Charles Tart. He's a well-respected researcher sitting upon the Bigelow Chair of Consciousness Studies. He's also the author of several must-read books, the latest of which is Body, Mind, Spirit, available through Hampton Roads Press, as well as Living the Mindful Life and Waking Up, and a book called Altered States of Consciousness, which is still in print, is it not, Charlie?
It's in print for people who contact me through my website, where they can order it from a small storage of them that I've kept over the years. But they may not be able to find it through any ordinary sort of bookstore. You might give people my website address.
What is your website address?
http://www. There must be some way to say that in some shorthand phrase, right? But I don't know it yet.
I always just kind of say what the actual address is and assume that everybody else knows to put the HTTP.
Then the actual address is Paradigm, PARADIGM /SYF.com/CTTART/. Got to get both T's in there because it was set up with my Charles T. Tart name in mind.
Gotcha.
And there's a lot of quite readable stuff there that I think people will find useful in seeing stuff about parapsychology, transpersonal psychology, and the like.
Well, then I will put in a personal recommendation. After you're through listening to this program, get right over to there and read all from the source. I drew a conclusion from reading all the data that you presented in Body, Mind, and Spirit that there seems to be some sort of common factor in all psi experiences. There seems to be some sort of web of connectivity between all life, and that this web kind of enables persons to perform these seemingly miraculous actions. Is that accurate in your mind?
I think that's a very important point to think about, Mark. You know, biologically, we tend to be separate. You know, I'm sort of inside my skin and have my needs, and you're inside your skin and have your needs. Mm-hmm. And that makes us inherently selfish. You know, that's part of being biological creatures. Now, we have philosophical ideas about connections and the web of life and so forth, and that affects us to some extent, but it tends to lose out when it comes up against that real biological separateness.
Right.
And that's where the parapsychological data and the transpersonal psychological data come in, okay? Mm-hmm. People can have mystical experiences, transpersonal experiences, where at an extremely deep level they feel one with all life. which of course has an enormous effect on the way they live afterwards.
Sure.
Like, many of them become much more ecologically conscious, not because they should be, but because it's obvious that that's the intelligent thing to do once you know you're connected.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people might say, well, that's nice, but maybe that's just an illusion. Maybe that's just a hallucination in your head that you're connected.
Mm-hmm.
But since we know people can sometimes have telepathic and clairvoyant experiences and really connect with other minds, with other objects in the universe, I say we have some evidence to say that connection experience, that unity experience, may be telling us about something real and vitally important, not just a delusion that's nice.
All right. Well, from a scientific or physics science aspect, would quantum physics be able to answer how that might work for us?
Maybe. I have a lot of parapsychologist friends who are also quantum physicists and who work from that basis, and I applaud and encourage their efforts. But at the moment, I find what quantum physics does for me as a non-physicist is remind me that the material universe is not so simple as we think it is. But in terms of actual understanding, in terms of being able, say, to actually affect paranormal abilities, the people who work from a quantum physics viewpoint don't get any better results than the people who wouldn't know a quantum from a hole in the ground.
I see.
I have this old-fashioned idea that if you really understand something, you can begin to control it.
Mm-hmm.
If the quantum physics approaches to ESP and the like were really on at this point, they'd get much better ESP results in experiments than we'd get otherwise, and they don't. Maybe they will someday.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, my big point is don't depend on the physicist to explain things for us. The mind, our minds, your mind, has to be studied on its own terms and understood and lived that way. We can't wait for some other field to do it for us.
Well, in the many years, I'm going to ask you a personal question here, and feel free not to answer if you don't want to.
Oh, this should be exciting.
In the many years that you've done this research and you've witnessed and validated all sorts of psychic phenomena, how has that changed you personally and professionally?
Well, let me put it this way. I've actually never done any research to validate psychic phenomena.
But
when I first went
into
into this field and read other people's research, it became quite clear to me that scientifically the evidence for things like telepathy and clairvoyance was overwhelmingly positive.
Mm-hmm.
But the evidence was not widely accepted for illogical reasons because of prejudice on the part of scientists. So there'd be no point in just accumulating more evidence of that sort that people weren't going to look at anyway.
Right.
The studies I've done have always been concerned with exploring new areas in parapsychology or trying to make psychic stuff work better or give us some indication as to how it actually works. And that's most of the thrust of modern parapsychological research. The few people doing it are mainly trying to understand it, not to prove it, because the question of whether people accept it or not so seldom rests on anybody logically looking at the evidence that it's not worth working in that field.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm trying to put myself into your shoes, and if I came into this field as somewhat skeptical or didn't know, agnostic, and found myself confronted with data that proved it to me, that might change me philosophically. And I was asking how exactly, if at all, has that changed you?
I know. I was working my way up to that.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I'm a professor, Mark. I tend to give these background statements. Yes, it's definitely had an effect on my philosophy of life.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, part of my interest in parapsychology arose from my own experiences as a child, experiences which I think are quite common to a lot of people in our culture. I was raised in a conventional religion, a Lutheran as a matter of fact.
Mm-hmm.
And as a child, I just believed what they told me, right? I didn't understand it all, but I basically believed it.
Sure, we all do.
And then as I became a teenager and started thinking for myself and started becoming educated in science and reading a lot of scientific stuff, I really became aware of the conventional clash between science and religion, with science seeming to throw the whole thing out as total superstition. Well, as I look back in retrospect, lots of people go through this conflict, and there are two main patterns that people go through. Some of them essentially throw out their religion once they come in contact with science.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll never have anything to do with it and say it's all nonsense. And I think that's a loss because there's something valuable mixed in with that religion, even if there's also nonsense mixed in.
Mm-hmm.
The other kind of person sort of compartmentalizes their mind. They go to church on Sunday morning for an hour and they're religious then, and close that compartment up at the end of the hour and go back to living a completely materialistic life the rest of the week.
Mm-hmm.
Well, compartmentalization is not healthy psychologically speaking either. I was lucky, as a teenager because while experiencing this conflict, I came across the old literature on parapsychology and realized I wasn't the first one to experience this conflict. A lot of intelligent men and women had thought about this for the last 50 years and had come up with this marvelous idea of, well, look, instead of just throwing religion out wholesale, why don't we take science as a method, not necessarily materialism, but science as a method for refining knowledge, which has worked so well in a lot of areas of life, and apply it to the religious, to the spiritual, to the psychic area, and try to figure out what's real and what's not real, what's superstition and what's actually a vital sort of truth. I was inspired by this ideal, and I basically devoted the rest of my life to it. So that, for instance, I would call myself now a spiritual seeker, right? Not a spiritual accomplished person, unfortunately, but I take that stuff seriously. I spend time meditating. I go on retreats and things like that because the scientific side of me is convinced there's something real there as well as my heart wanting to go in that direction.
I see.
At the same time, I'm proud to consider myself both a very tough-minded scientist and a spiritual seeker. I've managed to make that kind of reconciliation because I know that good quality scientific evidence shows that there's something in this direction that's worth looking at.
Well, you've taken it in a very positive light. The reason I asked you that question, because in one of your books, you wrote a chapter called Who's Afraid of Psychic Powers? Me. And in it, you tell the story of a group of people who are in your presence. You ask them to play a little game about their reactions to this magical pill, which would enable them to all become psychics, and they would not be able to shield their thoughts from one another. Would you mind telling the listeners the rest of that story?
Yeah, that actually happened at a gathering of parapsychologists, which makes it a very special occasion. Okay, there are very few scientific parapsychologists in the world. They're underpaid, overworked, have totally insufficient funds to do any really deep research. So you have to be something of a really devoted person and maybe have a martyr complex to become a scientific parapsychologist. Well, this was a group I was talking to. I'd given a lecture in New York, and then there was a special reception afterwards. And since I was the guest of honor and I had these older parapsychologists there, I thought I would consult their collective older wisdom on something that had been bothering me. And what had been bothering me is that I'm a very introspective person. I like to understand how my own mind works. And I'd noticed that sometimes I didn't want psychic abilities to work too well in my experiments. That I had a certain fear of psychic ability. And so I thought, well, I'd ask these older and wiser people about it and find out how to deal with it. So I raised the topic, and there were a couple of sort of abstract philosophical remarks about it, and the topic of conversation changed. Right. And I thought, that's odd. So I raised the topic again. And again, a couple of philosophical remarks, and the topic of conversation changed. Okay, so the psychologist in me got alerted. It said, wait a minute. I'm the guest of honor. They're supposed to pay attention to me, and yet they're clearly avoiding this topic. So I suddenly devised this little experiment. I said, look, I want you to pretend I've got a pill in my pocket. You take this pill. You'll be able to completely read the minds and feelings of everybody within 100 yards of you. And you'll never need to take it again because the effect is permanent. How many of you want the pill? Well, again, this philosophical conversation broke out. I said, wait a minute. How many of you want the pill? Nobody wanted it. Now, here were people who had devoted their lives, a great personal sacrifice, to studying these things. You'd think ordinarily the chance to make it work well, even in imagination, would be so exciting. Now, that led me to the discovery that underneath the surface, we have a lot of unexpressed fears about psychic ability.
And I can completely resonate with that on a personal level. I know that I call myself sufficiently psychic because I don't want to go any further than that. I'm not sure that I necessarily want to be able to express the ability of PK, for instance. Who would you tell? You know, how can you go on for the rest of your life? There is some interesting ramifications.
Oh, that's right. I've since done this kind of experiment in a more formal way with many different people and sort of catalog the kind of fears that come up. So, for instance, if you really knew what was going on in the mind of anybody within 100 yards of you, would you be responsible for them?
Yes.
Suppose they're having suicidal thoughts. How far does your responsibility go? You know, and a lot of people also said, I have enough trouble with my own thoughts.
Right.
I don't want to pick up those of a lot of other people. I'd have to go live in the mountains away from everybody to get away from this.
But if the implication, as we were saying before, that there is some sort of web of connectivity between all life, and that maybe as a species we're evolving to become more and more connected, it's going to be an interesting time for us.
I think the parapsychological data implies that web, okay? It doesn't prove that we're all connected all the time at this early stage of research, but it certainly says we can be vitally connected in deep and real ways at times.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that has an enormous implication for the way I live my life.
Mm-hmm.
It means, for instance, that somebody else's suffering is only partly somebody else's suffering. There's a real sense in which no man is an island.
Mm-hmm.
There's a real sense in which I'm concerned with being of help to other people because their happiness is my happiness.
Yes.
You know, and again, it's not moral obligation. It's not in the sense of you should be nice to other people or you're going to go to hell or something like that. It's more in the sense that when you begin to take this connection, this web seriously, it's the only intelligent thing to do to try to be of help to everybody else.
Absolutely, and that may be where science and religion might find a very real common denominator.
I also think science could be immensely valuable to genuine spirituality. Okay, I don't mean to organize religion, which in a sense has doctrines to uphold and a rigid orthodoxy, but when you get back to the deep spiritual experiences that are the basis of these, as a transpersonal psychologist, which is really more my identity than that of parapsychologist, actually,
Mm-hmm.
Parapsychology is sort of a specialty within the science of the spirit, the transpersonal psychology. But from that perspective, I would say people need to have deep spiritual experiences that affect them to the core of their being. And sometimes people have them spontaneously, but when we try to have them, technically speaking, we're not very good at it.
Right.
We can import spiritual systems from other parts of the world, and they sort of work for some people and don't work at all very well for other people. I'd love to see scientific methods applied to try to figure out what kind of spiritual practices really work for what specific kinds of people, so that we could give people a boost on their spiritual exploration.
And that leads me to my next question, but I'm going to have to take a short break before we can do that. I'm on the telephone today with Charles Tart. He's a transpersonal psychologist and one fine author. The Gateway radio program will return after these messages. Stay tuned.
Fascinating.
Compelling.
Profound.
Engrossing.
Stimulating.
Intense.
Inspiring.
Visionary.
Beyond the cutting edge.
Hampton Roads Publishing Company.
Books for the evolving human spirit.
Visit us at our website, www.hrpub.com, or call 1-800-766-8009 for a free catalog. www.hrpub.com, 1-800-766-8009.
Hampton Roads Publishing Company. The sound of pure enjoyment. Melodies which stretch the imagination. Metamusic as richly diverse as your moods. Creating a sense of well-being. For home or office, Metamusic provides the perfect ambient background for a stress-free environment. Working in concert with the patented Hemi-Sync technology developed by the world-renowned Monroe Institute, Metamusic is the perfect complement to your relaxation. For a sample of our many Metamusic titles, access our website at monroeinstitute.org or call 1-800-541-2488.
And we're back with Charles Tart. He's a visiting professor at the University of Nevada, sitting upon the Bigelow Chair of Consciousness Studies, also the author of several fine books on parapsychological phenomena. We were discussing before we began touching on personality traits of people who sort of feel prone to psi experiences. In drawing from your experience as a parapsychologist, what sort of personality traits do most talented psychics exhibit?
I think I can give you a definitive answer to that to the effect that we don't know.
I see.
Most of the research that's tried to correlate personality traits with psychic abilities either shows no results or real low-level results that aren't particularly useful.
I see.
So at the moment, I suspect everybody has some talent for psychic abilities, but it's probably suppressed in a lot of people. Mm-hmm. But we don't really know who would be good and who wouldn't without actually trying them on parapsychological tests.
Well, would you say perhaps that openness to these things being possible is a prerequisite?
Yes. That, of course, is a necessity. You have to be open to the possibility, although some skeptics have occasionally manifested psychic abilities, much to their surprise.
Mm-hmm. And immediately dismiss them, most probably.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a deep underlying fear there. Speaking about fears, a bottom line question for a lot of people, and I might say it's also a hope, is that there is life after death. The fear of death is a very prevalent one in our culture. And is that the byproduct of what you would call scientism? This fear of death, because science has presented this?
No, I think the fear of death is biologically based.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, I think that in some sense we have souls. We're something different from our material body, but we in this lifetime are incredibly tightly coupled with this material body.
Yes.
And it has been programmed to be afraid of death. That makes us more careful.
Mm-hmm.
When you start crossing a busy street and there's traffic zipping by each way, you should be afraid of death.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you more careful.
Or at least pain.
Yes, at least pain.
Mm-hmm.
But the question of might we survive death is a very interesting one that's becoming one of the main foci of my research right now.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think there's enough evidence of good scientific quality to say maybe. Okay, scientism, of course, just dismisses it totally. It says your mind, your personality is nothing but your brain, and obviously that turns into mush when you die, so how could anything survive?
Right.
But again, on one level, we have sort of some indirect evidence. If a mind can sometimes telepathically contact another mind anywhere on the planet, that's not terribly physical in terms of ordinary things. And nothing we know about the brain could provide a possible mechanism for that.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's more specific evidence for people who have near-death experiences, for instance,
the
convinced that they're going to survive death,
mm-hmm.
the out-of-the-body people, right? Now, to outsiders, that's not too impressive. Because, you can always say, well, they weren't really dead.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they weren't really dead because, by definition, dead men tell no tales. Maybe it was some kind of hallucination. In fact, the pseudo-skeptical theory I like the most says that evolution programmed us to have these wonderful experiences as we almost die.
Right.
Which makes no sense at all to me. I should think evolution would program us to have horrible experiences when we almost die, so we'd be more careful in the future.
I was about to say, that's a very benevolent viewpoint of evolution.
I know. But there really is specific evidence dealing on the question of survival after death, and that stuff, on the one hand, obtained through mediums from people who claim to have survived, and who sometimes provide specific evidence that they are who they claim to be.
Mm-hmm.
They come up with knowledge that's not known to the medium, that indicates maybe this really is Uncle Joe or Aunt Martha or something like that.
Right.
And on the other hand, we have some very interesting reincarnation cases, mostly collected by Professor Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia. There are some excellent cases of young kids suddenly starting to talk about a previous life and doing it in detailed ways that can be verified. And he has several thousand cases like this now. He's been working for many years. He's a very careful investigator.
Mm-hmm.
I had to give a talk on the question of survival of death a few years ago, and I summed up all the years I've been studying this in 2 sentences. One of them was to the effect that when I die, I'll probably have a period of unconsciousness and pain, but then I won't be too terribly surprised if I regain consciousness in some kind of non-physical form.
Mm-hmm.
That's my one conclusion. Okay? I don't know, but I won't be surprised.
Right.
But the second part of my conclusion is that I'll be very surprised if I regain consciousness after death.
You mean the ego you?
The ego, the personality, and so forth, because one of the things my psychological research has shown me is that we don't experience what our minds or souls might be like in isolation when we're in a body. What we normally take as our mind is really being very strongly influenced by the physical aspects of our body, by the input from the physical world all the time. And so we experience a sort of compound that arises out of that. Now, after we die, we're not going to have a physical body. We're not going to have that physical world thing.
Right.
So whatever does survive, I think, is going to have to change in various ways. And this is where my years of research on altered states of consciousness have made me real interested. I mean, what kind of consciousness can we experience now that's less bodily based? And might that have some relevance to what our consciousness might be like if we survive after death? So I'm getting real intrigued by these kind of answers.
Right. Well, science believes, from, again, not walking in that world, from what I understand, science believes that consciousness begins and ends with the brain. What are your viewpoints on that?
Okay, scientism believes that consciousness is nothing but the brain.
Okay, and we want to make that distinction.
Yes, in the sense that it's an automatic belief and acts like a dogma for a lot of people, okay? I mean, a lot of scientists are just like the most doctrinaire fundamentalists in this case.
Right.
Now, there is a separate, legitimate scientific theory that postulates that consciousness is nothing but the brain, that every aspect of consciousness can be reduced to some neurological function within the brain. That's a scientific theory in the sense that it's potentially capable of being tested. It's a long way from being tested because we don't know that much about brain functioning. It's incredibly complicated. But why I think that is not an especially good scientific theory is that go back to something like telepathy or clairvoyance. Nothing we know about the physical properties of a physical brain or any straightforward, reasonable extrapolations of those can account for telepathy or clairvoyance.
Right.
So take telepathy, for instance. Some people like an analogy of mental radio. We know you can generate electrical power in a radio transmitter that will cross space and be picked up by a receiver somewhere.
Yeah.
We're familiar with that. It makes us feel comfortable. Well, if telepathy depends on some kind of mental radio, we can detect radio waves with instruments, but we don't detect anything like that when somebody's trying to use telepathy. We also know that it would have to be a quite high power in order to get telepathy over long distances.
Yes.
It would be so easy to detect high-powered radio waves coming out of a brain, but they don't happen.
Right.
So, when somebody has a telepathic experience, mental radio, some ordinary physical explanation in terms of the way the brain functions, simply doesn't cover it. Not that I'm against brain research. I mean, I'm fascinated by it, We are part of this physical body and this biocomputer that is built into the brain. And the better we understand it, the better a life we can live from using it properly.
But you don't see it as the whole picture.
Right. It's not the whole thing. There's this something else. Call it mind or soul, whatever you like. There's this something else that we have good scientific evidence for.
Well, I'm going to leap here. I'm going to make an assumption that the folks that you've witnessed who are actually clairvoyant or have PK ability, they are involved in some sort of altered state of consciousness. Is that accurate?
No, I wouldn't make that jump.
I see.
A lot of these people, for instance, that I've seen, don't really quite know how they do it, actually. Like, for instance, one of the best remote viewers in the world, someone who can use clairvoyance to pick up stuff at a distant place, is Ingo Swann. And Ingo has done some excellent remote viewings while he's sitting there chatting and smoking a cigar. Well, you wouldn't say he's out of his body or if he's in an altered state of consciousness, it sure doesn't look that way. He's not obviously going in any kind of trance state or anything like that. But some people feel as if they need an altered state of consciousness to make their ESP ability work, but others feel they can access it in their ordinary state.
Well, how do you define consciousness personally? I'm sorry, I had to ask.
Well, many of my colleagues tie themselves in knots over defining consciousness. I don't worry about it for this reason. Defining, the act of using words and setting up exact meanings is one small aspect of the total spectrum of stuff we do and experience we call consciousness. Why should the part be able to define the whole? Why should this one little bit of the whole spectrum be able to come up with words that encompass the entire thing?
That's a fine answer. No.
I don't define my consciousness. I try to pay attention to what it's doing and learn something about it and use it in a positive way. If I'm looking at one tiny little aspect of it, then I'll use more definitions and so forth, but I won't kid myself that somehow I can define what consciousness is.
But that is what scientism tries to do, quantify what I like to call generically magic. They take the mysteries and take it in slices and try to figure out exactly the pathology involved.
Mm-hmm.
And
that's in part that's based on a useful technique. It's based on the technique of reductionism.
Mm-hmm.
When you have something complicated, try to break it down into simpler parts and understand the simpler parts. And then maybe you can take your understanding of those separate, simpler parts and put them back together to understand the complex thing. That works very well in a lot of areas of life.
Sure.
But it doesn't work in all areas, and it certainly hasn't worked well for consciousness.
How can the public possibly influence our scientists to become less involved in scientism and reductionism, and to possibly move into a little more of these deeper mysteries, take them more seriously? How do you see the public getting involved in that sort of thing?
I think by putting a lot of effort and energy into promoting this kind of stuff. For instance, we now have a National Institute of Alternative Medicine. Mm-hmm. It's still small potatoes compared to the conventional kind of thing, but it was kind of politically forced to come into existence as they realized that Americans are spending more money on alternative medicine and healers than they are on conventional stuff. That forces a political reaction. Mm-hmm. Other than things like that, there's not much that can be done unless people are willing to actively lobby for supportive research in this area and the like. And that gets into a tricky area, okay? You could lobby for something that turns out to be, just some sort of mystical mumbo-jumbo instead of solidly based on any science. Mm-hmm. That doesn't help in the long run politically.
Right.
And the public can also do a lot by learning to be more discriminating.
In which way?
To believe everything labeled psychic or spiritual or New Age is to be terribly indiscriminating and to put a lot of superstition into yourself. Yeah. To throw it all away is to be just as ignorant, just as biased.
Yes.
In another way, to educate yourself, to look, for instance, when you're reading a book, is it written by someone with scientific training who's got a commitment to discriminating among the truth? Mm-hmm. Or is it written by someone who already has a belief system and is simply trying to sell you their particular belief system?
Right. And as we were talking about before, these beliefs have a value in and of themselves, but they may not contain the ultimate truth or even a partial glimmer of the ultimate truth.
Yes. So it's important to take your own beliefs lightly.
Mm-hmm.
I try to do this. I can't do it all the time, of course, but I try to take whatever I believe as a working tool. It's a shorthand way of thinking about certain things. It's useful in certain ways, but it doesn't mean it's ultimately true in some sense.
Right.
So I try to keep coming back to what's my actual experience of the world, of myself, as separate from what I tend to believe about it. Mm-hmm. And that's not an easy thing to do. The Waking Up book we mentioned, or the Living the Mindful Life book, are really about developing capacities of self-observation, a more objective kind of self-observation to learn the truth about yourself and the world, instead of having your mind sort of run automatically by whatever beliefs you have.
And that in itself is not only a very powerful path. I too spend a lot of time doing exactly that, but I find that it's a never-ending path.
That's right.
It just keeps on evolving, and no matter what it is that you adapt as a new belief system to supplant the old belief system or perhaps modify it, it just doesn't stop.
If I ever catch myself thinking I finally know the truth, I think I'm going to be in a very dangerous and deluded situation.
So basically what we're saying here is that no matter how deep we go, it's all futile anyway. There are many truths and perhaps only one truth with many different aspects, and maybe we'll just never really know the truth.
But on the other hand, we can have fewer falsehoods. We can have fewer delusions.
This is true.
That's what I've been kidding about enlightenment and darkenment before,
Right.
We can learn about the ways in which we fool ourselves and pick up the flavors of those things and catch ourselves doing it and drop those things. And then we have a greater opportunity to learn what's really going on with ourselves, with our spirits, with our minds, with our world. That is something we can definitely make progress along. Mm-hmm. I'm a long, long way from being enlightened, whatever that means, but I'm not as badly deluded as I used to be 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Or at least you would like to believe.
Or so I believe, right? And I have to watch that belief closely.
Well, I'm quite confident you've made incredible strides with all of the work you've done.
And you've actually known me for a long time, Mark. Did I used to be more obviously crazy than I am now?
Actually, Charlie, I've never really known you all that intimately. We've had a few encounters and a few discussions, and I've never seen you as crazy, but always, as you described yourself before, a seeker of the truth. And I think that there's no more noble goal than to at least find the truth of yourself.
Well, thank you. I'll take that as a great compliment.
And believe me, it was meant as one. Charles Tart, author of incredible books, which, as I've said several times, I highly recommend. Waking Up, Living the Mindful Life, Open Mind, Discriminating Mind, currently out of press. Maybe if you scream loud enough out there, somebody will put it back out there and make it available. I highly recommend it. And his latest book is published by Hampton Roads. That is correct, yeah. And it's called Body, Mind, Spirit. It is a compendium of many different parapsychological researchers. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Good. I thank you so much for being with us today. You've really made for an interesting conversation.
It's not only been a pleasure, Mark, but I like to do things like this. There are vital truths there that people need to know about. And if in my role as an educator I can point people in the direction of finding that stuff out, I'm very pleased.
Well, you serve your life's mission well, my friend. You certainly have opened up a few doors for me and have helped me along on my personal journey. I thank you so much for being with us, and I hope that we can do this again sometime.
All right.
You take good care of yourself, Chuck.
Okay, you too, Mark.
Don't go away, folks. We'll be right back in just a few moments.
Peace of mind. For some, an elusive goal in today's hectic environment. For some, a way of life. Hemi-Sync, a patented audio guidance technology developed by the Monroe Institute, has been facilitating peace of mind for thousands of people worldwide for over 30 years. This unique combination of carefully sequenced sound patterns promotes the optimum brainwave responses for relaxation. Hemi-Sync has been proven safe and effective in clinical applications where a relaxing environment is necessary. Isn't it time you have your own peace of mind? For more information about the many fine Hemi-Sync products, access our website at monroeinstitute.org or call 1-800-541-2488.
Stargate, a top-secret government project created to study remote viewing, the ability to describe unknown objects, people, places, and things through psychic ability. For over 20 years, psychic spy Joseph McMoneagle worked to develop and use his remote viewing skills for national security purposes. In his classic book, Mind Trek, he describes how remote viewing developed and tells how it really works. Now, in the new revised edition, he includes an entire chapter on the previously top-secret Stargate program. This is Frank DeMarco, chairman of Hampton Roads Publishing Company. Buy Mind Trek from your local bookstore or directly from us at 1-800-766-8009 and ask for our free catalog. Visit our website, www.hrpub.com. Hampton Roads Publishing Company, books for the evolving human spirit.
Our guest today was Dr. Charles Tart. He's written many important books on the subject of scientific and psychological aspects of spirituality. I wanted to make sure that you have his web address again. I'll give it to you so that you can visit this site. There are many documents up there which you might find interesting if you're one of those people who is seeking a means of understanding the complexities inherent in our own spiritual searches. I'll give you that web address again in just a moment, so get something to write on if you haven't got it already. There are many interesting questions that are raised when considering our place in the universe. I personally have found it very interesting to observe my own beliefs and how I've come to them. I've put many of them to the test, and not surprisingly, some have fallen to the wayside, while others remained. I suppose the most fascinating thing in these observances of myself and my thinking patterns for me is that my brain even has this capacity to try and figure itself out, to ask these questions of itself. It leads me to believe that it's my responsibility, in some sense, to grow and to evolve into something greater or someone greater than I have been the year before. Perhaps this might even be the responsibility of humankind as a whole. These ideas are not new ones for me. I've always found myself wondering how things in the world worked. I find it interesting that as we come closer to the close of what I call millennia fever, more and more people are asking basically the same questions. Perhaps it's nothing more than millennia fever. Perhaps it's something far more. I really don't know. I do know, however, that there seems to be a lot of popularity at the moment with things that are unexplained. You can't watch daytime television anymore without someone covering some sort of unexplained phenomena, whether it be UFO abductions or mediumship or ESP or some other aspect of psychic functioning. Daytime talk shows are full of this material, and it captivates us, and it's very controversial. It's good for ratings. But as we discussed today, there's a lot of exciting evidence for these types of phenomena, and I really applaud the efforts of everyone in the field doing this research. It's important, in my opinion, to try and discover the mechanisms behind these. Like Dr. Tart, I feel that it's equally important to learn to separate the wheat from the chaff when it comes to what spiritual system we adopt for ourselves. It seems that as millennia fever reaches critical mass and we are bombarded with the many and varied paths of enlightenment, it's also becoming more and more important that we become responsible to find our own paths, the ones that enable us to grow and continue to evolve into productive beings who walk with grace on this planet. These can enhance our own lives and humanity as a whole, possibly. It's very easy for us to be followers as a species and let someone else lead the way. It is more fulfilling, however, and more self-empowering for us to discover our own, what works for us and what doesn't. This is the essence of Dr. Tart's work, in my opinion, and he gives you some very valuable tools which you can use to discover this for yourself. That website address, again, for those of you who are interested in looking into Charlie Tart's work, is Paradigm, PARADIGM -sys/CTTART. That's Paradigm, PARADIGM-sis.com/CTTART. Next week, we'll take a look at the art of healing from a scientific and experiential point of view. My guest will be Gary Carter. She's the author of Healing Myself, and Justine Owens, who's a researcher at the Center for the Studies of Complementary and Alternative Therapies, or CSCAT as an acronym, which is a division of the Office of Alternative Medicine for the National Institute of Health. Till then, this is Mark Serto wishing you peace on your personal journey.
Be certain to tune in next week to the Gateway Radio program and become informed on the latest information on the fascinating field of consciousness exploration and its practical application. The opinions and the views of the guests are presented to inform you on various phenomena in our world and are not necessarily in accordance with the views of the producers or the Monroe Institute. For more information on the Gateway Radio program, write to Gateway Radio, care of the Monroe Institute, 62 Roberts Mountain Road, Faber, Virginia, 22938. This edition of the Gateway Radio program is the exclusive property of the Monroe Institute, copyright 1997, and is broadcast by permission. Any unauthorized broadcast or duplication of this program is prohibited by law. Thank you for listening.